But we begin tonight with karma. You reap what you sow. What goes around comes around. All that good stuff. Karma can be cruel, ironic, but it is always right on time. And at the center of the morality play about political karma is Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, or is it DeSantis? I don't think we ever found out. Whatever the pronunciation of a name few in history will remember, the tale ended for Ron just where it started, on Elon Twitter, where back in May, DeSantis kicked off his long-anticipated presidential campaign during a disastrous launch event on Twitter Spaces, only to return to the platform, now rebranded as X, where he misquoted former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill as he dropped out of the race. The Republican Party is the clown show after all, starring Ron DeSantis as its most classless clown, just one devoid of charisma or humor, a sad, weird clown who has the personality of a wet paper bag. Who ever heard of a clown with such a tortured smile?
And as your president, I will not let you down. God bless you.
Governor DeSantis, thank you.
But Ron was a clown nonetheless, whose lore includes the bizarre habit of eating chocolate pudding with 3 of his fingers, not 1 finger, but 3 of them. You know, 3 of them, like kind of like a scoop. But a clown who is devoid of jokes is like a presidential candidate without integrity. You're going to do your best to hide those deficiencies from the American public, but you're probably going to just call attention to them. Enter Bootgate. In trying to hide how he fell short on protecting his state's citizens from the aftermath of a hurricane, which is a Florida governor's main job, DeSantis stepped out in pristine white boots, shoe lifts, and heels, trying to be tall, as nearly every insurer fled his state. And when he was asked about his shoe lifts on the campaign trail, he managed to make it cringe.
They want to talk about how tall you are, sir. Respond, please.
Oh, yeah, look, Eric, this is no time for foot fetishes. We've got serious problems as a country.
But what Ron DeSantis was so desperately trying to conceal had nothing to do with his height and everything to do with his obsession with power. In fact, he torched his entire state for one purpose: to become the Republican nominee for president. A lot of people told him it's too early, not your turn. But he didn't listen. He pitched himself as Diet Trump, with all the cruelty but none of the calories. But instead, he became extra sugar Trump, even meaner, even crueler, just without the charisma. And something nobody even asked for. He ravaged his entire state into a swamp of mean for the purpose of becoming president, pushing a legislative agenda heavy on the sadism. He signed the Don't Say Gay law, stoking harassment of drag shows and LGBTQ people. He pushed through anti-woke legislation that deemed Black history of no educational value and sold slavery as job skills training, making a mockery of Florida education and making Florida the leader in book bans. He chased teachers out of the classroom and screamed at teenage students on television for wearing masks to protect their health. He went to war with Disney and sued the cruise industry for trying to keep COVID off their ships. He hired a ridiculous surgeon general who questioned the safety of masks and vaccines, even as tens of thousands of elderly Floridians died. DeSantis is also behind a vile and inhumane immigration bill, imposing penalties and restrictions on undocumented immigrants in Florida, a bill so morally disastrous that a leading Miami archbishop said it would criminalize empathy. It's also been horrible for the economy, chasing thousands of Latino workers out of the state, causing them to literally flee and leaving the construction and agricultural industries hanging. He also splurged taxpayer money to ship brown people from Texas, a state that he has no business governing, to Martha's Vineyard like cargo. He signed a 6-week abortion ban in the middle of the night because, maybe the women won't notice. He is, after all, much more than a clown, but rather the avatar of white Christian nationalism and grievance politics. And he thought that he could win the White House by owning the libs. Turn out it was the world's biggest self-own. He has now dropped out of the presidential race, only to kiss Trump's ring days after he lamented all the other Republicans doing exactly that. But what do you expect from Baby MAGA? A Florida man who came up on an ad showing his baby in a MAGA onesie and his other child building a MAGA wall with toy blocks, only to wind up deflating on the campaign trail and ending up exactly where he started, swathed in a MAGA onesie of his own, groveling for Trump. Joining me now is Brandon Wolf, National Press Secretary for the Human Rights Campaign and a 2016 Pulse nightclub shooting survivor, and Charlie Sykes, editor-at-large of The Bulwark. Thank you both for being here. Brandon, I owe it to you, since you are a leader of an organization that actually declared Florida unsafe for LGBTQ people to travel. And as somebody who's had to live as a person of color and as a gay man in the state of Florida under Ron DeSantis, I owe it to you to give you the first word on his political demise.
Well, thank you for having me, Joy. If you see a grin on my face today, I am sorry. I can't help it. Nothing goes better with my happy hour drink than the implosion of Ron DeSantis's presidential campaign. And as Human Rights Campaign President Kelly Robinson likes to say around the office, I think we might just be in the find out era of politics. And we both saw Ron DeSantis found out. He found out that the kitten heels, the pudding fingers, the inability to smile like a human being for more than 10 seconds, that just won't cut it under the brightest lights in this country. And quite frankly, America found out what Floridians have known for a very long time, that Ron DeSantis is a cruel, craven political operative who not only failed his own state, but would be a disaster for this country. The more that America got a look at Ron DeSantis, the more they saw books being banned, the more they saw curriculum being censored, the more they saw businesses being punished for speaking out, the more they saw politicians being placed in between patients and their doctors. The American people saw a man who drove good people, some of whom were my good friends, out of his state in search of basic civil liberties because he was so desperate to be president. Ron DeSantis made his entire political personality about some soulless anti-LGBTQ plus cruelty crusade, and not a single person was buying it. So he lost in perfectly humiliating fashion. Yes, this grin is going to stay on for a while, but the damage that he has done in Florida will outlast the blip he is on the political radar. And I know that Floridians are going to be fighting for a long time to uproot his cancer.
Indeed. Well said. But I want to let you, Charlie Sykes, listen to, you wrote a column called Ron DeSantis' biggest 2024 miscalculation. I'll read you to you. This was DeSantis' most fundamental miscalculation. Rather than go for soft Trumpers or Republicans who are skeptical of the former president, DeSantis went hard for the hardcore base. That meant continually moving to the right, embracing a reactionary pugilism and draconian reactionary policies that he thought would wean MAGA loyalists from their orange messiah. But the MAGA faithful don't care about the policies or the legislation. They wanted the show. Please say more.
Well, again, as Joe Scarborough said this morning, if you can go see Fat Elvis, why would you go to Vegas to see an Elvis imitator? I mean, he was the real thing. It was an indication that Ron DeSantis was not a man of real political genius, that he went to war with Disney, the state's biggest employer. He went to war with Mickey Mouse. And yet, when he ran against Donald Trump, he could not figure out a way to run against a man who had more than 90 felony indictments, who had been found liable for raping a woman, who had been twice impeached, disgraced, and tried to overturn the government. He couldn't figure out, what can I say about him? How can I run against him? So he chose all of these other targets. He also made the calculation that somehow if he made all the right enemies, if he checked all the right boxes, that would be enough. But the reality was, the Republicans had the real thing. They didn't need somebody who was stiff and boring and fake when they had the orange Elvis out there. And so, again, there was part of Ron DeSantis that is probably still shocked by the fact that Republicans still embraced Donald Trump. I think that Ron DeSantis believed that if he was cruel enough, moved hard enough to the right, that something would happen to move Republicans away from Donald Trump. That if he was indicted, if he was charged, that somehow that would break his hold on the party, and it just never happened. So everything that he did basically just blew up in his face.
Yeah.
And by the way, he ended the way. Again, as you pointed out, he actually believed that Twitter was real life, a fundamental mistake, as fundamental as you can get.
Absolutely. Yeah. For a brief time, I worked for a company called Beverage Marketing and as an analyst. And look up the story of New Coke and see how that went. People just wanted the regular Coke. They didn't want New Coke. Let me play you what he thinks went wrong. This is Ron DeSantis trying to explain what went wrong. Here he is.
I would say if I could have one thing change, I wish Trump hadn't been indicted on any of this stuff.
I came in not really doing as much media. I should have just been blanketing. I should have gone on all the corporate shows. I should have gone on everything.
Brandon, he thinks that the problem is not that he ran a campaign against his own citizens and to try to destroy people in his state. He thinks that's not the problem. The problem is people didn't see enough of him. Your thoughts?
Well, listen, you don't have to look much further than his own team that at one point was saying the world needs to see less of Ron DeSantis. If he's going to win the presidency of the United States of America, people have to see him less. We've got to hide him. We've got to keep him off the TV. And the truth is that, you know, you talked about the damage that he's done in Florida and the way that that turned people off. There's a whole collection of people like Ron DeSantis right now, right-wing politicians around the country who are desperate to climb those rungs of power that have been sold a false bill of goods. They were told by these think tanks, groups like the Alliance Defending Freedom and the Heritage Foundation, that all they have to do is be cruel enough to LGBTQ plus people, and that will, you know, usher them in as the heir apparent to the Trump dynasty. And they were wrong. Over and over again, the American people have sent a very clear message that we actually really value freedom. We see it as an unconditional value worth defending, not some campaign slogan that you can put on a personality-less bumper and sell to us that we'll buy. You know, the American people have said, we believe people deserve the freedom to read, the freedom to learn, the freedom to go to the doctor, to love, to live, without having to call our local congressperson first. And we know that because in elections in, you know, just the last year, Virginia, Ohio, Kentucky, anti-LGBTQ politicians are losing. In poll after poll, Americans say, please stop focusing on culture wars and solve real problems. So, you know, Ron DeSantis was Ron DeSantis's biggest problem, and the damage he's done in Florida turned off the entire nation.